When I was in high school, I had one of the worst jobs ever created. I did telephone surveys. You know those people who call you up when you're trying to eat dinner and ask you a series of annoying questions? You know those people? Well, that was my job. And so I would call up and say, hello, my name is Dave Reiss, and I'm calling from audits and surveys. I'd like to ask you a few questions about soft drinks and soda pop. And as you can imagine, before I completed that sentence, most people would have hung up, right? Or I would get the firm but polite saying, I'm sorry, I don't want to buy anything, which I would have to explain, well, I'm not really selling anything. I'm just calling to ask a few questions. By then, most people then would be hanging up, of course. And then you have those people who maybe take a little pity on me and be willing to answer the questions I have. And so, but they would get about halfway through the survey and they'd probably get bored or annoyed or just want to do something else. So they would try to say, I'm sorry, I gotta go or whatever. And I'd have to try to convince them to keep going and finish that survey. Because if I didn't finish the survey, then all that time, that survey wouldn't count for anything. So I just kind of wasted even more time. And I really hated that job and it was really annoying. It was the worst job for an insecure teenager and someone who hated and still hates really talking on the phone. So it was just not a great job, and it was mostly filled with, at least the night shift and the weekend shift was filled with high school students or college students just trying to get some money. But there were occasional other older adults that were there. There was one man who was there that seemed maybe more of an expert. He was, older at the time, maybe in his mid-40s. But he was really good at getting people to complete the survey. He would be able to coax them along so that they would go all the way through. I don't know how he did it. It wasn't like that great personality when you talk to him, just a normal conversation, but he was able to do that for this job. And you would hear him say things like, you're doing great, man, you're doing great, or 1 to 10, man, 1 to 10, or just a few more questions, man, just a few more questions. And he'd say that, and eventually he'd get the survey complete. It was just amazing to watch. Well, not really amazing, but it was interesting to watch. It was a lot better than actually doing these surveys itself. But today, we're continuing our series on Simon Peter. And we've seen in the past 2 weeks, we've seen Simon out on a boat. The first is after a long, unsuccessful night of fishing. And the second is in the middle of a storm. And both of those times, after in the middle of these things, Jesus shows up and does something amazing. But now we see Peter, he's walking along with Jesus and his disciples, other disciples. And the stories of Peter that we discover help us understand that Peter is just like you and me. He's someone who loves Jesus, but he also is someone that struggles to follow Jesus. He has a knack for putting his foot in his mouth, saying something that gets him in trouble. He likes to leap before he looks. He sinks when he should swim. He's someone who had no formal religious training. He wasn't like had this spiritual pedigree or came from this highly religious family. And yet Jesus chose him to be one of his disciples, along with these other group of fishermen and other people, tax collectors, zealots, people you wouldn't expect to be following a rabbi. But these were the people that Jesus chose to be with him. And they were traveling from town to town, learning from Jesus as he preaches and he teaches and he heals people. And they're getting to know who Jesus is so that and realizing that Jesus is working in them and preparing them for their future ministry. And as Jesus was walking with his disciples in an area known as Caesarea Philippi, he decides to have his own survey, to give them a survey to help them to see where they're at. So he has a 2-question survey. The first question is, who do people say I am? And the second question is, who do you say I am? And so his first question, he's saying, who are the people? Who are the crowd? The people, what's the word on the street? What are people saying that I am? Right? And before we look at their answers, if you were to ask someone outside the church, maybe not someone that's a professing Christian, but someone that you know, if you were to ask them, who is Jesus? What are some of the answers you might hear?
Son of God.
Son of God, okay. What about people who may be outside of church? What might they say? They don't know? They're like, I don't know who this is. Excellent. Healer. What was that? A healer, yeah. Excellent. Any other thoughts? That's a question, yes. What? Savior, yes. Yes, it's an interesting question that people kind of wrestle with, especially people who haven't grown up in the church. They don't know who Jesus is. And so we have, most historians would say that there was a man named Jesus who lived 2,000 years ago, who had a following, and most people outside the church would say, yeah, this Jesus guy that lived there, he was a good guy. He taught people to love people and do good things, right? But C.S. Lewis would say that that's not accurate. He says that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. We see that in our story today. Jesus says, who do people say the Son of Man is? When he uses this term, Son of Man, there's a general idea of Son of Man could just be referred to as a person. Who do people say the person is? But he's actually connecting to a prophecy from Daniel where it talks about God comes in a cloud as the Son of Man. And Jesus actually uses that quote from Daniel when he's on trial. And then all of a sudden, as soon as he uses that quote about himself, he's accused of blasphemy. And so C.S. Lewis would suggest that Jesus couldn't be considered a good man, just a good man, that because if he was a good man, he would either be a liar because he's going around saying he's God and he's not. He's a liar, so that makes him not good. He's just trying to trick people. Or he's crazy. He's a lunatic, and so he just thinks he's God, so that's not a good person. Or he's actually who he says he is, that he is God, he's Lord. Now, there are some people who would say, yeah, there was this guy, Jesus, he was real, but there's no such thing as miracles. So this Jesus guy, he did good things, he talked to good people, but we can believe the things that he said, but we can't believe the actions that he did, that these miracles didn't happen. And others would suggest that this idea of Jesus is just a myth, that maybe there was this historical figure, but it's kind of this myth has been built up around him. And who we look at Jesus in the Bible, who people talk about Jesus, isn't who he really is. And so that's what a lot of people outside of the church might think who Jesus is. When Jesus asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? They reply, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And so they say maybe people think you're John the Baptist. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. They spent some time together, but then John was killed by Herod. And maybe people are there's two people confused. Maybe they think that Jesus is John the Baptist, and so they're mixing their stories together. Or maybe they think he's one of those Old Testament prophets that have come back. He's Elijah or Jeremiah. Jesus is some sort of messenger from God, someone who has a deep connection and speaks God's words to the people, and someone set apart by God to bring a message to the people. So Jesus thinks about that, and after he gets a pulse of what the crowd is saying about him, he asks his disciples directly. He says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? And so before we see what the disciples say, if someone were to ask you, who do you think Jesus is? What are some things that you would say?
He's my strength.
Is your strength? Excellent. Son of God. Son of God. Excellent. Savior.
My friend. Lord of my life.
Lord of my life, yeah.
Counselor.
Counselor, excellent. Yeah, so we have these all ideas of this is who Jesus is. As we spend time with him, we get to know him. We have these thoughts and these ideas that come, we read in the scripture and go, yes, this is who Jesus is. So Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say I am? I can imagine, though, there's probably a pause. And the disciples maybe see the thought bubbles showing up and thinking, "Ooh, is this a trick question? Should I answer it? Well, what if I get it wrong? I'm not going to answer this. What does he mean? What's he trying to get at? What's this question all about?" And then finally, Simon Peter steps up. I don't know if he does it nervously, timidly, or if he's kind of like, I've got the answer. But he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So Peter here gives two truths about Jesus, two truths that help us understand who Jesus is. And these aren't the only truths that we know about Jesus, but they're a starting point, they're a foundation, truths that help us build on our understanding of who Jesus is. So first he says, you are the Messiah. And this word Messiah literally means anointed one. And an anointed one was often someone who was set apart by God for something special. The kings of Israel were anointed with oil. You see, King Saul and King David were anointed and showing that they had this kingly assignment. The priests were anointed, showing that they were set apart by God to help lead their people. So he's saying, you're an anointed one of God. But more specifically, Peter says you are the Messiah, the anointed one. The Old Testament prophets had been speaking of this anointed one that was going to come. They thought of it as an ideal king who would rule the people with righteousness and justice. And they had this idea that this Messiah would come and he would be this human with extraordinary leadership gifts. And he would be courageous and bold and devoted to God. He would seek justice and righteousness, but he would also be this warrior and priest and king. And he would help raise an army to cast out the Romans. And he would lead the people to restore them to a place of honor. And this was the Messiah that Simon Peter was looking for. And then he says, you are the Son of the living God. And so this term, Son of God, often would refer to someone who has this deeply personal relationship with God. And in the Psalms, we see King David kind of described that way. So Peter's saying that Jesus, you have this unique, intimate, and personal relationship with God. But also is this kind of a political proclamation, because back then, the Caesar was exalted to by the people as a son of a god. The Romans worshipped the Caesar as if he were a god. And so by Simon declaring that Jesus is the Son of the living God, he's claiming that Jesus had this place of authority. He wasn't just the son of any mere dead god or a god, that Jesus was the son of a living God that was at work. And so he offers these proclamations that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus does what any good teacher would do to Simon Peter. He affirms it and he lets him know how appreciative and what blessing he is. It says that Jesus saw something in Simon Peter that no one else saw. Not even Peter. Jesus saw potential. He looked at Simon's exterior, his penchant for making rash decisions and folding under pressure, and into Peter's heart. There he saw the qualities that would work and the abilities he could mold. So Jesus saw Peter, and he knew that there was something special about Peter. He was at work in Peter. Then he says to Peter, he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but the Father in heaven." It says that God has revealed this something special to you, Simon. And now he's going to bless him. He's going to do what a good teacher does, and he's going to give his star pupil a nickname. He says, "You, Simon, you are Simon, son of Jonah, and I will call you Peter." You are Peter. Peter means, or the Jewish word would be Cephas, or rock. Just the term rock, like rocky, right? So he's saying, you are rock. You are rocky. And this is where it doesn't mean just any little rock that we might see on the ground. It's refers to like a tall rock cliffs or a large, massive rock. It says, you are that type of rock. And on this rock, I will build my church. The Simon Peter, this massive rock, which will be the foundation. And Jesus, will establish my church on this. And you can imagine that he is feeling like then, that Simon feeling like Rocky after he ran up the steps of the museum and was all up there chanting and being excited, that he's feeling on top of the world. Now, some believe that Jesus is saying that Peter himself is the rock, that he is the one on whom the foundation of the church will be built. And of course, we know that Peter becomes a foundational leader of the church. We see him in Acts preaching and bringing thousands of people to faith. We see him healing people and sharing good news with Jews and Gentiles. We see him being arrested for the sake of the gospel, because Peter is one of those foundational, essential leaders. But I would disagree with the Catholic brothers and sisters who would see Peter as kind of more than that, and they see him as the first pope, as this human leader of the church. And I don't think that's really what Jesus was getting at, because Jesus knew that Peter, like all of us, is just a flawed human that messes up just like you and me. And so none of us are really that rock. We're not the rock that Jesus is building the church on. But most people, a lot of other people would say that Jesus is getting at that the rock is Simon's declaration, this idea that Simon brings forth, that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Son of God, that is the foundation for which Jesus will build his church. And so Peter's confession is a central idea to help us grow and build the church of God. And Jesus' words to Peter were affirming to him and making him feel that he had done something great, that he was getting almost like a promotion amongst the disciples, and that would establish some sort of authority that he had. Because then he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." I can imagine Simon's maybe feeling a little bit more arrogant at that time, that he's got it down. And there's much we can unpack of what Jesus is saying about Simon's position and authority, both here on earth and also in heaven. But we have to realize that Simon is just one of us. He's a human that we get these words of appreciation. Sometimes we can take these compliments a little bit too far. We get this taste of authority, and we kind of blow it out of proportion. We think we're the teacher's pet. We've been, Simon Peter's been given this nickname, and now he's got some sort of power or authority. That this rock he's being called will be some sort of foundation. Maybe it gets to his head. We get oftentimes these positions of power and authority, they go to people's heads. And that's why we see so much war and struggle in our world, because people want power. They crave power. They desire to have power. And people fight to keep and even gain more power. And that's why we have struggles even here in our country, especially these partisan politics where Republicans and Democrats are just fighting each other over issues and trying to make sure that their tribe or their team have the power. Instead of really working together for the betterment of others, they fight for power. And so Peter's got this idea that he's been given this power, and so he wants to hold on to that. And there's this saying that's attributed to people like Voltaire or Mark Twain or several others, but it goes something like this: that in the beginning, God created mankind in his image, and then mankind returned the favor. In other words, God designed man. He created us in his image. And then we decided to reshape God and form him into the God that we want. And so Peter, he was reshaping his idea of who Jesus was. He wanted Jesus to be his Messiah, his anointed one, his warrior, kingly priest, the one that would bring an age of reckoning to the Romans and elevate the nation of Israel. That's not who Jesus was. He was not that Messiah. He was bringing a day of reckoning, but it wasn't against the Romans. It was against sin and the devil and the powers and authorities of this earth that are keeping humanity apart from God. Jesus, the Son of the living God, was coming to restore a relationship between the Father and all people. So Jesus came and he offered himself as a sacrifice for our sins. And he just begins to tell his disciples that. He says to them, he begins to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. And Jesus begins to paint this picture of what's going to happen to him and what it's going to be like to follow him. And it's not what they expect. Because following Jesus isn't about glitz and glamour. It's not about power and authority in the way that we think about it. The way of Jesus is a way of suffering and sacrifice. It's laying down yourself for others. It goes against our human nature to look out for ourselves, to grab power, to hold on to it as long as we can at whatever means possible. But Adam Hamilton says that Jesus' driving value was not what was easy, safe, or would make him happy. It was what would please God and accomplish God's purpose. He believed that his suffering, death, and resurrection would be used by God to redeem, save, and transform the world. But Peter didn't like what Jesus was saying. He didn't think Jesus was doing the right thing or saying the right thing. So it says that Peter took him aside and rebuked him. He pulls Jesus aside and he tries to correct him, saying, like, Jesus, listen, you got to stop talking like that. Jesus, you're starting to freak out the crowd. They're going to turn their back on you. People don't want to hear that you're going to die. They want to hear the great things that you're going to do. You're starting to make people feel uncomfortable. And Peter says, never, Lord. This shall never happen to you. Peter, the rock, is going to make sure that his Messiah gets into the power that he deserves. And Peter thinks he is doing what is right. He is going to try to protect the ministry. He's going to try to protect Jesus. And he thinks he is doing what is best for God. But Jesus has a different plan. Jesus has a different way of doing this. It says that Simon Peter, though, follows a pattern that by now we should be familiar. After taking a great step forward in faith, he takes a step back. Once more, we see that people fall side Simon Peter. Bold, foolish, faithful, yet slow. So Simon thinks he's doing what is right, thinks he's calling Jesus out in the way that he should. Then Jesus says something to knock him down. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Get behind me, Satan. At 1 minute, Jesus is calling Simon the rock. The next, he's calling him a stumbling block. Peter goes from hero to zero. He goes from riding high to wanting to die. He goes from teacher's pet to classroom threat. And here's one that will work for many people on different levels. He goes from Dwayne the Rock to Barney Rubble. Trouble. All right. But Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Can't imagine how hard those words would feel. How much it would bruise his ego, how much he would want to crawl into a cave, die. Why would Jesus call his disciple, this one he just called the rock, why would he call him Satan? The last time we see the devil in the scriptures, Jesus is alone in the wilderness. And the devil comes and tempts him. He's tempting Jesus to give up this foolish attempt at redeeming humanity. And one of the temptations, the devil says that the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him that all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And the devil says, "All this I give to you," he says, "if you bow down and worship me." The devil's trying to tell Jesus that there's an easier way to accomplish this divine plan, that the plan that Jesus had to come to earth, maybe that's not the best plan. And Simon, when he says to Jesus that he shouldn't do that or rebukes Jesus, he is inadvertently allowing Jesus or telling Jesus that his divine plan is incorrect. There's got to be an easier way, a better way to gain power and control. That the idea that Jesus doesn't need to take our sin and our shame and our punishment on himself is the ultimate temptation. If there was a way to circumvent the cross, maybe that would be better. This is the temptation that Jesus had been wrestling with. He was wrestling with it when he was in the wilderness with the devil. He was wrestling with it now as Peter tries to tell him that there's a different way. And he wrestled with it in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's praying the night before he's crucified that the Father would take this cup, but then he says, "But not my will, but yours be done." Get behind me, Satan. What you're suggesting, Peter, Jesus is saying that what you're suggesting is from the devil. It's as the Father, we saw, as the Father revealed the truth to you of who I am, Satan reveals lies to you in your arrogance, Simon. And he says, you are a stumbling block. You don't have the mind concern, or the mind and concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Simon Peter, the rock, is this stumbling block, this thing that would trip Jesus up. And Simon wants Jesus to be this Messiah, this priestly warrior king. He doesn't understand that Jesus has to be God's suffering servant. The servant who for the joy set before him endures the cross, who scorns its shame, and endures opposition from sinners, so that all who call on Jesus will be saved. He doesn't understand that Jesus will be tempted in every way, just as we are, that he didn't sin, so that we can approach the throne of God's grace with confidence and receive mercy in time of our need. So what can we take from the story of Simon Peter? What do we take from the rock who becomes the stumbling block? Well, the truth is that we can all be Peter sometimes. We can all declare God's greatness 1 minute and then succumb to our sinfulness the next. Have you ever gone from hero to zero? Have you ever gone from the rock to the stumbling block? Have you ever declared, like Proverbs 3, 5, 6, that you trust in the Lord with all your heart, but then lean on your own understanding? Or is that just me? Have you ever spent time in worship to God and just really feeling God's presence in your life as you spend at church, and then only to leave and cuss out some driver because they just did something stupid? Or is that just me? Have you ever spent time where you just really spent time reading scriptures and studying God's word, only to get in a huge fight with your spouse? Or is that just me? Have you ever gone on some spiritual retreat and really experienced a spiritual high and was excited to live passionately for God, only to leave your Bible closed for the next week or month? Or is that just me? So last week, we saw this idea of Jesus walking on the water. And I thought, I love that story, and I thought, what would be a great way to show this idea? And I thought, I'm going to show this clip from one of my favorite movies, Forrest Gump. And I love that movie, and I love showing video clips. I thought this would be great. But then, after the service, I was pulled aside and reminded, we can't do that. We can't show video clips right now. We have to get a license agreement. And I knew that in my head, but I didn't really think about it. I just wanted to be the hero, so I was going to show this clip. So I went from being a rock to being a stumbling block, from being hero to zero, knowing that I made a mistake and I'm sorry for that. And the thing is, we think about these people who go from that. We think these people are hypocrites, right? These people, they say one thing and they do another. We hate that. We hate people who are hypocrites, who say they follow Jesus, but then they live in sinfulness the next moment. They say they want to follow Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, but then they tell Jesus that their way is better than his. And some people claim the problem with the church is that it's full of hypocrites. But I say that's not the problem. The problem is that we fail to admit that we are hypocrites. Because we are all hypocrites. We all fall short of God's standards. We're all sinful people in need of amazing grace. And each day, even though we say we love Jesus, we are going to fail. And so one of the things we as a church need to be more about is admitting that we are hypocrites, that we can proclaim God's love and grace. We can also fail to live it out at times. And the problem, and that's the problem we see over and over in our lives. We see that over and over in Simon Peter's life, where he thinks he's doing the right thing and he messes up and he feels like a hypocrite. But yet Jesus works through him and helps him overcome that. And we think that we can't admit to people our failings. When we admit our failings, it only makes the credibility less. And we think that people won't come to love Jesus or believe in Jesus if we admit that we fail. But the truth is that when we hide our mistakes, we try to hide those things, that's when we truly fail. When we try to justify our actions and hide them, that's when things get worse. One of the things, if you see in the news, and it's happening lately a lot, is that a lot of churches have been covering up such things like sex scandals and things where pastors and religious leaders are engaging in a lot of inappropriate things, and they try to cover up these scandals because they think if the news or the word gets out, it's going to hurt their church. It's going to hurt their religious institution. And so they put this institution above the safety and concern of the people and helping the people that they're called to care for. Because they're given to this temptation for power and control. Instead of following the way of the suffering servant, since they say that they're doing it to protect others, but they become a stumbling block. It's destroying the witness of our churches. It's tainting the name of Jesus and who they say they are following. They're going from spiritual heroes to hypocritical zeros. Simon Peter, the rock that is the stumbling block, that is the dichotomy that we all live in. We all declare as Christians that we love Jesus and that Jesus is Lord, He is the Son of God, and that we strive to live our lives witnessing to Him. But we have to admit our failings. We need to promote God's grace. In my Bible, there's this quote. It says that Simon Peter serves as a mirror for Christians. His decisions are relatable. His human nature is recognizable. His boldness and his cowardice touch our hearts. For all his bluster, confusion, wrongheadedness, mistakes, the man was deemed even useful and essential by the Son of God. And so if you're feeling unworthy in your walk with Christ, look to the Apostle Peter for inspiration. Because we are all like Simon Peter. At one moment, we're the rock. At one moment, we're a stumbling block. But the true rock, the rock of ages, isn't this fisherman. It's the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus, who built his church on his sacrifice. And Jesus extends his amazing grace that overcomes the gates of death and Hades, that Jesus holds the keys of the kingdom of heaven in his hand, and he has the authority to bind up or let loose things in heaven and on earth. Jesus is our rock. Jesus is our fortress. Jesus is our deliverer. He's the rock of ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in him.